Hey, everybody. Welcome to the 18th Bend Film Festival. Thanks for joining us for the Protecting the Ancients film block. I'm delighted to be here for 20 minutes to sit down with a couple of our filmmakers from the block. And if you've got an extra 20 minutes to spend with us, we'd love to have you stick around. And we're going to ask some questions and kind of dig a little further into them as storytellers and the stories they were telling. So I'm Graham. I live here in Bend. I'm a local storyteller and professional climber. And I'm here with Maggie O'Day and Elsa M. Sebastian and Daniel Byers. And each of these folks had a film in the block. And I would love to start by doing some introductions. So what I'd love to ask each of you is just to answer, what's your name? Where are you? And what drew you to the art of storytelling? And why don't we start with you, Elsa?
Hey, my name is Elsa, and I am the producer and also one of the characters in the film Understory. And I am from here in Southeast Alaska. I grew up in a fishing village, and I'm a commercial fisherman. I was drawn to the art of storytelling, I guess in my early 20s. I got really fired up about the Pebble Mine issue. And I actually took a semester off from college to come home to Alaska and try to engage with the campaign. And I had the privilege of working to just help distribute the film Red Gold, which is about commercial fishermen and indigenous folks in Bristol Bay. And it was so powerful to realize how that film was changing people's hearts and minds across the United States. Folks who had never even seen the ocean before felt so connected to this watershed. So that's what really pulled me into documentary film, and I've kind of been engaged in a lot of projects since then.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that. Maggie, what about you?
I'm Maggie O'Day, and I live in Humboldt County, California. And the first thing when you say storytelling, I think, well, I have Irish descendants, and the Irish love to tell stories. And so I grew up in a family that loved telling stories. And so there's something, there's a preservation of energy, right? And an invitation to like join in a time that's not the present. And I think for me, for this particular film, I actually start out in the film saying that the land holds a story, right? And so I've actually done a lot of earth clearing and earth energy work. And we often don't think that all of the people who've lived on a land, their frequency is actually still in that land. And so for me with Keystone, it was bringing to life a story that the bison, can't speak English, right? So to speak for the land and the bison that can't speak for themselves.
Well, that's really powerful. That's really cool. Also, when you talk about Irish storytelling, I think David White is Irish, if I'm not mistaken, and he's always somebody I gravitate towards, is like very, very inspirational. So hearing you engage with that tradition is really cool. Daniel, what about you?
Hey, I'm Daniel. I'm here in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm the director of Aguilucho, Dance of the Harpy Eagle. And I think what drew me to storytelling, very much exemplified in this project, is this relationship with wilderness, the indigenous systems of knowledge, how incredibly important they are. And we live in a strange time where so much is being created all the time, and there's this cutting edge of the new that's always kind of on the tip of our tongues and in our media. But I got very interested in sort of the sometimes very harsh cutting edge of what is also being lost, what is disappearing from the world. And I think some of these systems of knowledge about how to live in better balance with the land and with other species, I think they're absolutely key to sort of our entire civilization's chance of survival in the global crises that we're in, environmentally, ecologically, culturally. So I think that is maybe what drives me to keep telling stories.
I love that. That sense of indigenous knowledge is something I'd love to dig into here in a couple of minutes. And okay, so I have like some specific questions for you guys about your films. I'll also encourage you to feel free to kind of spin off wherever you want to go. If you find yourself, being drawn to talk about something that's not necessarily connected to what I'm asking about, totally okay. And I think to that point, also I was gonna start with you. So I've worked on a number of adventure films. Or certainly for me falls into that category of this like massive journey up the Alaskan coast. And I know that there, in those stories, there are oftentimes kind of stories amongst the broader story that end up on the cutting room floor that I know that in my experience, I've oftentimes miss. And I'm curious, like, if you can share, is there anything that you weren't able to include in the film that really, I don't know, that feels like something cool to bring up now, something to kind of share to add to that story?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Understory follows just one of the ground truthing projects that I've been involved in. And it was boat based, and a big part of the reason for wanting to have it be boat based is so we could bring along a film team. But yeah, me and Natalie and Mara, we've been ground truthing in the Tongass for a few years now. And I think the most impactful thing that we've learned through that experience is just moving on the landscape like animals. We've done like 100-mile long bushwhacking adventures through the Tongass. And when you're wearing, a 50-pound backpack and like trying to crawl through a clear cut because there's no other way to get up on top of the ridgeline that's going to carry you to the next watershed, you are experiencing what habitat destruction feels like for a bear or for a deer. You're kind of like you're forced into the same channels of movement that those animals are. And I felt like that was a really challenging thing to film, mostly because Southeast Alaska is just such a rugged country, and it was hard to get the cameras up into those places as much as we wanted to. But yeah, that was definitely part of the adventure that we didn't get as deep into as I would have liked.
That's amazing. I think is there anywhere else where you're kind of pushing out content around this trip where folks can kind of further explore what you're up to up there?
Yeah, we are on Instagram, and we try to keep it up to date. I'll say that none of the ladies involved in this project are on social media all that much, but you can definitely check out Last Stands Tongass on Instagram. I think it's last.stands.tongass. And we're sharing some content there, especially as there's a lot of big political things happening around the Tongass. That's a really good time for us to share some of our stories about how logging actually feels in the Tongass and what's really left of this rainforest, because we are at a critical threshold.
Cool. And well, I think we'll dig into that a little more here in just a minute. That's awesome. So Maggie, I want to hear a little bit about how you found yourself working specifically with the story of bison. You kind of presented to us before this broader kind of relationship with landscape and wanted to tell that story, but kind of how did you end up narrowing in on bison as, the keystone species that you wanted to work with?
It really comes from this larger perspective of where I see we need to shift in terms of how this marriage between natural resources and our economy and how we actually view natural resources. And so it's actually an excerpt from a book that I'm going to be publishing here soon. And the larger context of that is that we've been mostly viewing natural resources from a purely materialistic perspective. And this largely has to do with actually this connection between Adam Smith, the grandfather of modern capitalism, and Sir Isaac Newton. And so capitalism was actually inspired by Newtonian physics. And so Newton's saying everything in the universe can be quantified. And Adam Smith comes about 40, 50 years later and says, well, if everything can be quantified, then everything can be bought and sold in a market system and have a market value. So therefore, the forest, for example, becomes what's the market value for lumber in a capitalistic system. And in a Newtonian perspective, that checks out. Well, now we know that existence is far beyond just materialist, right? There's an energy form, because that's the quantum perspective is that it's both simultaneously a wave and a particle. And so in that, there's the necessary that we need to actually value the relationships that these animals are and natural resources are fostering. So for example, in our economy now, we look at the cattle industry and we say, well, this is a great food source for people, right? But when we actually factor in all of the relationships, all of the broader pictures, so when you look at cattle from this economic and natural resource perspective, you're like, wait, we're using our most valuable agricultural land, this super rich soil to grow GMO corn for cows. Cows are allergic to corn. So we're using the biggest consumer of antibiotics to treat cattle and their infections, which cause superbugs. The GMO corn, the fertilizers, all of this, because I grew up in Iowa, is polluting the Mississippi River horribly, right? We're having huge topsoil loss. In the last 100 years, we've lost half of our topsoil in Iowa. You look at the Ogallala Aquifer. So you look at all of these things that we're depleting from our environment just to have cattle. It doesn't make sense economically when you start to factor these things in. So you look at bison, we've extracted bison from their natural resource as an act of war and genocide against Native Indigenous people. That's the only reason that we killed basically 40 million bison down to, like, some people say 200 or 2,000, right? Well, these creatures have evolved in their landscape for over 2 million years. And if you watch the film, which you all have, so we've watched the film, so you know all the ways that they've evolved in this landscape. So really, I'm telling the story of the bison as an example of how we need to shift our perception of natural resources as a species, so that we're not purely looking at how can we extract from the earth, because our time of just extraction is basically like the lease is up, guys. You know, we need to look at how can we input our resources, how can we foster these ecosystems so that they're here not only for us now, but for future generations. And again, when we look at bringing the bison back and using that as a more indigenous food source, I'm going to say, we actually simultaneously get a huge carbon sink. And that is this line west of, Nebraska, basically, eastern Nebraska. It's the 100th meridian, right? This line, basically, that's a huge amount of our landmass in the United States. And if we brought that back, it would actually, from an economic perspective, now we have this huge carbon sink, we have a food source. So that's really why I'm looking at the bison, because I see it as such a prime example of how we as humans have come in from this place of thinking we know better than nature, instead of looking from nature and working with nature to enhance those natural resources. So I know we get a bit lengthy on that, but I'm just deeply passionate about it because I love nature and I love humans, and I would love to see us come together in a more prolific and harmonious way. So
Maggie, that's really powerful. I really appreciate you sharing all that. That's really cool. And I think that, okay, so Daniel, I want to ask you a question. I first want to ask you kind of a simple question, then I have kind of something broader that I'd love for us all to chat about a little bit. But Daniel, first, how did you end up down in the Darien Gap? I mean, you're in New York right now. What took you down there to work with the indigenous tribes down there?
Well, sure, yeah. And I just want to say also, it's amazing to me hearing these other accounts, how diverse these different topics are in Keystone and Tangos, but how universal they are too. These questions of these critical threshold resource extraction, and these systems that achieve equilibrium over millions of years, and then all of a sudden we are disrupting them and seeing the consequences of that. It's pretty incredible how worldwide this phenomenon is, and how just like critical it is for us to be telling these stories and addressing it in a material way. So I got down to the Darien through some friends of mine at the Peregrine Fund, who I've been talking to for a while, and they'd been telling me a bit about the harpy eagle down there, which is an amazing bird, just absolutely beautiful, incredible creature. But up until that point, the Darien Gap is kind of, it's a battleground. There's militant groups, there's cartels, there's a huge amount of human migration that goes through that area. It's quite lawless. And so for a while I was like, I don't know if I want to go to sort of like that type of setting to tell a wildlife story. I'm not sure if that's what I'm ready to sign up for. But then I heard the story of the Embera people, and I just found the story so extraordinary because it was this incredibly positive story. The story is sort of this virtuous cycle, because here was a group of people that they were faced with this unbelievable outside pressure, much as in some of the other accounts we've heard, deforestation, logging, invasion from cattle ranchers, settlers. And yet they had created this situation in which they were both protecting their native landscape and the habitat for this, charismatic species, this harpy eagle. And in the process of so doing, they were generating economic benefit to themselves through growing ecotourism and interest in the eagle, and also a rediscovery of ancestral heritage and cultural practices. And so the film came to sort of become about one of these, about the dance that is inspired by the movements of the eagle that the Embera people had really started to lose as a culture, and then rediscovered as a result of this greater conservation practice and this rediscovery, this coming to appreciate and protect this beautiful animal. So yeah, I found myself down there. It's very difficult to get in. It's very difficult to film a harpy eagle in its nest. You have to climb up 120 feet into a quipo tree, and we had to build a bamboo blind and platform to put our 200-pound camera rig on, and get it all up there and try and capture a very sort of rare event, this 20-minute feeding event we wanted to show between the adult and the nestling, which only happens every few days. Came right down to the wire. We almost didn't make it, but it ended up being a pretty beautiful adventure, both in terms of the collaboration and getting to know the people, and getting to hang out and up in the trees, swaying with the wind, and spending some time with the biggest, heaviest, most beautiful eagle on the planet.
That's awesome. That sounds like quite the adventure. And I really, so something I kind of want to sort of tee up as a bit of a discussion between the four of us, that I think that your film, Daniel, was like quite explicit about, but I think does have very strong ties to the other two films, is the idea of Indigenous knowledge and the importance of Indigenous knowledge in relationship with space. And I think that at least in my kind of personal work, particularly here in the Western United States and then down in Brazil, it consistently shows up that if we can lean into the Indigenous knowledge, then we have a lot of the solutions that we need for how to proceed forward. And I kind of, Maggie and Elsa, I wanted to sort of ask you, how do you feel like that perspective fits into the stories that you were telling? And Daniel, I'd love to have you kind of dig into that as well.
I'll go first. So I feel incredibly blessed that I was able to spend around 5 years living in Kona, Hawaii, and I was in a situation where I immediately got brought in by into the close circle of a Indigenous Hawaiian family, and I started learning about the ancient texts, the Kumulipu, and some of these a very ancient Hawaiian practices, and one of them being the ahupua'a. And the ahupua'a is how the islands were basically kind of like cut up like pieces of a pie to be, and within that pie, you had to get all your natural resources from that slice of the pie. So you had to get your forest from up the island. Your fishing ponds were down below, and they actually fed the fish sweet potatoes and things, right? And so the way that natural resource cultivation, the way that they actually cultivated and enhanced the natural resources and the natural abundance of the earth was so inspiring to me, that I saw that in the role of the bison. Like, if we perceive that as we were cultivating the bison, we were cultivating the landscape through this, instead of just, doing what our ancestors had, most of us from Europe had been eating cattle because that's what was indigenous there. So why not just bring the cattle over, right? Instead of working with that indigenous knowledge of like, no, we need to enhance what is already on the earth in where we live, because that's has evolved there for millions of years. So that's just kind of where that inspiration came from.
Love that.
Yeah.
Also, what are you?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go. I'm psyched for you guys to have a discussion.
Well, I just briefly wanted to say, wanted to comment on what Maggie was talking about earlier. And I think this sort of false duality that we've been presented with about sort of like conservation and the economy, this idea that, oh, it would be nice if we could do conservation, but we can't have it because of the economy. We need to do the thing that's right for the economy, that these things are opposed. But, in fact, with any perspective, mostly it's better economically as well to protect our wild places. And that was one of the things that I found really powerful about the Embros story, showing that keeping their natural environment intact was even short-term better for them economically. And I think really, the economic argument, it only benefits opportunists, very greedy opportunists in the very short term. And if you look at it with any perspective, to more people, the general population of any community anywhere over any length of time, then the opposite is true. And so I think that's kind of a false dichotomy that I think it's really important for us to erode. And I'm glad that we're speaking about it.
Yeah, I'm excited by that topic too. And it's seen in the film, in our film about the Tongass, that the economics don't work out. That's always been the argument for logging the Tongass, but taxpayers are actually paying for these logging jobs. And the question people always come away from or with after watching our film is, why are we still doing it? Like if the money doesn't make sense, if that argument isn't valid, then why? And I hate to say it, but there's really no good answer, which is why it needs to change. But to get to your question, Graham, about how the role of Indigenous knowledge, I just want to, express gratitude for Marina Anderson, who is featured in our film. And Marina is Haida and Tlingit, and she's super involved in the Haida community of Kasan. She's on the tribal council, and she's also working for the tribe. But I think what is so cool about spending time with Indigenous people here in Southeast Alaska is how I learn lessons from them just in the way they spend time with us. That like with Marina, she has all of these jobs in her community that, she's working for the tribe, but she's also, harvesting foods for her elders and, taking care of her community. And she has all of these relationships. But when we passed through her village while we were filming Understory on our journey, she took days to host us. And was so generous with her time. And it was like, there was never a bad time to stop by her house and have a cup of coffee. She was always hosting, little bonfires down on her beach where folks from the community would drop by and make art and, just kind of hang out. And she, walked with us and did multiple interviews and was just so generous with her time. And I think that that's something for those of us who are involved in conservation and environmental fights. Like, a lot of times our priorities in the way, we're spending our lives can get skewed because these issues feel so urgent, and they are so urgent. But what I learned from Marina, and like what I learned from other Indigenous friends here in Southeast Alaska, is that we have the time for relationship, and we have to take that time. We have to make space for it. And that's human relationship, but that's also relationship with the land. And I think that as I've, like with my project, it's a ground truthing project. I'm getting out into the land, I'm walking around, I'm not a scientist, I'm a citizen scientist, but people in our Western culture often question the validity of those kind of projects. If you're not measuring something, then what are you doing? And I think, as an environmentalist, I have had to become confident and become really proud of the work I've done to develop relationship with the place I'm from. And that's not just, what's pristine and what's beautiful, but it's also what has borne the scars of human impact. And for here, that's mostly logging, but also mining. So that's one of the most important lessons I think I've learned as an individual. But and to take that a little bit further, I mean, here in Southeast Alaska, the Forest Service removed Indigenous people from the land. They actually burned down fish camps. Haida and Tlingit people used to have, sort of the winter village, but then all of these summer homes where they would go to these different salmon streams and harvest, and all of those, impermanent settlements were burned down. And that's part, and now some of those places are, quote unquote wilderness. And that's something that we have to grapple with moving forward is, what are these places really if we don't have human connection with them, and who are going to be the stewards of these places if we sever those ties? And I'm really excited with the Biden administration right now. There is real commitment to including Indigenous knowledge in the way we're managing our lands, and that's becoming a reality here in Southeast Alaska. And it gives me hope because I feel like there are a generation of Tlingit and Haida leaders who are willing to, do the work to guide us towards a better way of being with the land here. So it feels like a really exciting time for that.
Elsa, that's really powerful. And this conversation is awesome. Y'all are great. I really appreciate you putting the time into telling these stories and into showing up to share here. And I'm just gonna ask a few more questions. And Elsa, the last one I have for you is about, your film was made during the Trump administration. And we're now in a different administration, the Biden administration. And it sounds like you have a lot of positive outlook on how that could affect the Tongass. And, it's like, what can we do? Like, is that something we should be calling our reps? Is it something like what actionables do we have as citizens?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. Yeah, I mean, the conservation environmental issues were pretty dark during the Trump administration, and the Tongass was actually excluded from the protections of the roadless rule, which meant that half of the Tongass that had been protected for the last 20 years lost their protections. And that process was, a really challenging one for local people here in Southeast, because the majority of local people turned out and said, hey, these protections are working for us. They're working for our communities, and we want them to stay in place. And the Trump administration Forest Service just completely ignored that. And within the last month of the Trump administration, we lost those protections. But in July, the Biden administration came out and said that they were going to work to replace those roadless protections and also bring an end to logging of old growth in the Tongass, with the exception of like cultural needs for totem poles and canoes, proper use of old growth trees. So that is a huge, exciting step forward for the Tongass. And I think it's really deserved in this time too, because there's been new data published just within this last year that shows that the Tongass holds 44%, nearly half of all of the carbon that's held in our national forests. So national action is clearly needed. And within the next few days, even today, I'm not sure when it's going to come out, but it's expected this week. The Biden administration is going to open a public comment period through the U.S. Forest Service on the roadless rule decision, and also on this end of old growth logging. So it's really a time where we need national engagement. People really turned out during the Trump administration to fight for roadless protections to remain in place. And even with this more positive outlook, we really need all of those folks to show back up for the Tongass and even more. So I'm hopeful that people will take a minute and go to my website, which is www.laststands.org. Also, you can get there through www.tongassfilm.com, which I think is the link we share in our film. But please do go to my website, and there's a take action page. And as soon as that comment period goes live, I'll be sharing a link there. Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Elsa, I will go and I'll sign up. That's awesome. And so, okay, just one more for Maggie and one more for Daniel. Maggie, so, we've covered this a little bit, but it kind of like, we're looking at the Tongass, we're looking at a, pretty well-defined geographic area. But then when we look, like, why do you feel that Keystone is especially important in presenting solutions to the problem humanity is facing today, which I think kind of takes us into a broader scope of that relationship with space?
I think it's especially important right now because I think that we can easily get into a place where we feel helpless around climate change. And I really perceive climate change as actually just one aspect of environmental issues that we're facing as a species right now. And so what I love about the story of Keystone is that you can actually have an impact by just looking at what you're eating personally, looking at where you're investing your money, and feeling as though you as an individual actually can have a significant impact, because you can start to tell people, you can have someone over and serve them bison instead of beef if you're a meat eater, or start to eat lentils sometimes. I'm a huge lentil fan, like really look at how you can change instead of just turning it all off and saying, you know what, this is for government officials. Because frankly, I think we've passed that time where the government is going to save us from ourselves. I think we are in a place where we need to look at, where are we investing our money? If we are investing money, where are we investing for getting our food? How can we participate in the solution and take that power back? It's not a helpless situation. And that's why, again, I love bison as a solution, because it actually eliminates all these problems and has all of this positivity that comes out of it. And so that's why I think it's so powerful, because we are in this critical time where we really need to look at, what are the changes that I can make in my own life to contribute to the preservation of our children being able to have good, healthy access to food and air and water and all of these things that I took for granted as a child. And my child doesn't have that luxury, right? She's 5. And when she comes of age, she's not going to be able to take that for granted, that she can eat halibut whenever she wants to, right? And so we are in this time where it's like, again, look at what you can do instead of the magnitude of the problem.
I love that. It's really powerful. And as we I feel like we're kind of expanding out here as we finish. Daniel, looking at the global perspective and looking at how we support Indigenous communities and support the idea of taking on, Indigenous practices and incorporating Indigenous knowledge, what do you think, as we kind of send off our viewers here with ideas for how they can, make the world a better place, and what would you recommend we get at?
Yeah, well, it's great to hear Maggie speaking to the importance of the action you can take, and also speaking to some of these good news stories that are coming out of, government action as well. It's nice to hear some good news for a change every once in a while. I think it's powerful to, where possible, try to engage with groups that are on the right track, that are doing this work, that are bigger than the individual. And sometimes those groups are smaller than governments sometimes. So I guess I'll speak to the middle right now, and NGOs and other groups that are operating in good ways. The organization I was working with was the Peregrine Fund, and they do awesome bird conservation around the globe for a bunch of different raptor species. Highly recommend you check them out. Highly recommend you support them. I think there's a lot of groups like that, and I think if you can be part of something bigger than yourself, you'll make more of an impact than on your own. And when it comes to indigenous knowledge systems, I mean, I think I've spoken about how, like, the proof is in the pudding in this case, and I think I'd love to see more stories like that. I'd love to tell more stories like that about how these, like, systems of knowledge can create equilibrium and balance in a way that we absolutely do not have in our own society right now and need to. And at the same time, I think that there's a real sort of practical element to it and a joy to it as well. And so I'll just tell you one little story about indigenous knowledge that I experienced when I was there, which was that we got out into the woods, and after a long journey to get to the rainforest, we trekked out there, and we realized we had to get 100 feet up in a tree in order to film a harpy eagle. And so we had brought along some native hardwood in order to build a tree stand. And after 8 hours of banging on that hardwood with a hammer and trying to get through it with a drill, we realized we had put one board up after 8 hours. And that was not going to cut it, because we had already missed one feeding, and we knew that we had time to film one more. We had about 3 days, and it was only going to happen once. They don't come back too often to feed the nestlings. So we said, there's no way we can spend 8 hours per board to do this. We'll just be done. And we were at a loss. We thought that the expedition was essentially a failure at that point. So, about half the community had come out there with us into the rainforest in order to take part in this process. It was very collaborative. The Peregrine Fund actually employs technicians, trains biologists amongst the Embera tribe. And so we talked to one of the local technicians who's in the film, Christian, and he suggested, well, why don't we just build it out of bamboo? It's native knowledge. We don't have to use a single nail. We can use vines to lash it together. It'll be lighter, it'll be faster, we can get the blind up. And we did it, and we put it together, and we got it up in the tree at about midnight, slept for about 3 hours. And then just as the sun was coming up at 4, as I was trying to get up into the tree, we got a call from the blind down below. He was there. The adult male had come back, and he had a howler monkey, which is the size of a small person. I mean, these are big, big animals. And so he'd come back with a full howler monkey, and he was in the nest. And I have never climbed 100 feet vertical faster in my life, and never built a camera with shakier hands, knowing that if I dropped a single piece, it was over, right? But got up there, built the camera, and managed to film this incredible act of feeding between a father and daughter, harpy eagle. And it was very humbling too, I have to say, because as I said, the howler monkey is about the size of a small person, and I was watching them rip it to pieces, and very tenderly, the father feeding it to his daughter. And I thought, man, we weren't always in control of this planet. It wasn't always, the power systems weren't always aligned with us on top. And we should remember that they might not be, again, pretty soon, especially if we continue the way that we're going. So we need to have respect. We need to have respect for indigenous systems of knowledge, for nature, for wilderness, for other species, what they can teach us, and just have some humility for our place in the universe. I think that's what I would end on.
That's awesome. Y'all are great. I have really enjoyed chatting with each of you, and I'm excited to see what you do next as well. And we'll follow up on the work you're doing. So hey, thanks to everyone for tuning in. Anybody who's signed in and watching, Bend Film has stuff going on all the time, both throughout the weekend of the festival and throughout the year. I think going to the website is the best place to go to check that out. And big thanks to the three of you. I really appreciate your perspective. I really appreciate your storytelling, and I really appreciate you being here today. Y'all are great.
Thanks, Graham.
Thanks,
Thanks so
Graham.
much.